Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored Radio Show. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and I'm very glad right now to welcome back to the program José Luis Granados Ceja, who's an experienced journalist based in Mexico City, co-host of the Canal Once public affairs television program Sin Muros, as well as Soberanía, the Mexican politics podcast. He covers Latin America for DropSite News, which listeners will know because I quote them constantly, and works as a writer, editor, photographer, correspondent, radio host, TV producer, and on-camera analyst with a particular focus on social movements and labor unions throughout Latin America. José Luis, welcome back.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always good to be here with you. Although some of the topics are difficult, I'm glad we have this space to talk about them.
Yeah, well, you know what? As Gabor Mate said, let our hearts be broken together. So, and starting off, I mean, it's heartbreaking, and it's also like to quote a friend of mine who's a refugee, you have to laugh because there's so much to cry about. So we'll start here with Hondurasgate. And as the People's Dispatch reported, audio recordings recently leaked and published by multiple media outlets suggest that a plan was hatched by the Trump administration, financed by Israeli capital and Argentine President Milei, and agreed upon with local Honduran elites to return the former president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, convicted of drug trafficking and pardoned by the Trump administration, because of course, bring him back to power, persecute the left-wing opposition, and wage campaigns to discredit progressive governments of Claudia Sheinbaum and Gustavo Petro. Those are presidents of Mexico and Colombia, respectively. And I believe Brazil's Lula was also in the crosshairs there, because why not? So, Jose Luis, I mean, it's no secret that the U.S. tries to destabilize any government that won't be a sycophant to U.S. imperialism. So how is this different, if it is? And what does it tell us about the larger web closing in on Latin America?
Yeah, so it reveals to us that, it's not a conspiracy to think about what the U.S. is doing in the region. I think we have more and more evidence every day that they're basically pulling out all the stops, right? That there is going to be this intent to try to dominate the region by any and all means necessary and that are available to them. And this one is really interesting because, these audio files are published. They're published originally by Diario Red, which is the Spanish TV station and website. It was founded by Pablo Iglesias. They also have a Latin America edition, and in conjunction with a new website called Hondurasgate. And they deliberately decided to kind of be anonymous because of the concerns around security for journalists in Honduras, which I think is perfectly legitimate. But that made a lot of people kind of question it, right? They're like, where did this come from? Who are these people? These are huge allegations. They're pretty cynical, right? I mean, it's really quite extraordinary what these stories are telling us about, this plot to quite literally install a convicted drug trafficker back in power because the United States knows that he's going to do exactly what the United States wants him to do, and to have a really strong foothold in the region to try to promote U.S. policy, not just in Honduras and not just in Central America, but throughout the entire continent. And, these claims are so extraordinary that I think legitimately so, a lot of people had their doubts, myself included. Are these authentic? And so, they published the stories. And then I think because of some of the observations people made, like, where did this come from? Is this real? They actually published their own Hondurasgate website. The full audio files, they're still online. You can go and find them for yourselves and listen to them. And they ran it through a software called Phonexia. There was some controversy around this because Phonexia, the company, which I believe is a Czech company, has actually tried to wash their hands of it, saying we had nothing to do with it. But it's software. You buy a license, you use it, and it tells you, right? And essentially, the software determined that it was not AI generated, because these days you can make some pretty convincing AI generated audio files that include some of the artifacts that you would expect from a normal human voice. But so there's software out there that's able to determine this, and they did a full rundown. Every single one was determined to not be AI generated. But of course, over at DropSite, we decided to do our own investigation. There's this NGO called Earshot that specializes in using audio technology to try to advance the human rights issues. And we asked them to analyze 3 files in particular. We figured it wasn't necessary to do the whole 37 files, because these were the ones that we found that we felt were the most interesting ones. And they were able to come back to us, again, confirming that these were not AI generated, that they were in fact humans. And we took the additional step of providing them with known recordings of the two individuals that we were asking them to look at, which was former President Juan Orlando Hernandez and current president from the same political party, Nasri Asfura. And they came back and they told us with a moderate degree of confidence that it was, in fact, the individuals they claimed were in the audio files. So in other words, yes, this is Juan Orlando Hernandez, although for the record, he is denying it. He's saying that it's not him on these audio files. He apparently had his own investigator look at it, but of course, he didn't provide the report. Our report is on our website. You can read it for yourself. You can find out the actual kind of mechanics of what they did in terms of making their determination. So anyway, all that to say is that we're pretty confident that these are real. And they speak to a very complex plot, as you well said in your introduction here, to try to influence not just Honduras. Obviously, there is a plan here. The audio file itself says, it's a message from former President Juan Orlando Hernandez to Nasri Asfura saying, you're in the presidential chair because of me, and I'm going to be president. And we'll see what happens. I mean, it's quite likely that he's going to try to return to Honduras and run for office, and maybe he'll win. His party's in power. He, is someone who is believed to have engaged in fraud in his reelection. So it wouldn't be terribly surprising if things stay the same, that he becomes president a few years down the road here. The elections are held every 4 years in Honduras. So that's the situation there. And the idea is it's really quite telling about how far the United States is willing to go, because so he talks about returning to power, returning to office, opening up the country to the interest of U.S. capital, to build more of these sedes, these like charter cities, which are essentially these autonomous cities that don't even have to respond to the Honduran constitution. And then he also talks about this plot to create what is essentially a fake news website, a website designed for political ends to criticize, and he says specifically, the governments of Honduras, of course, the left-wing forces in Honduras, the Zelaya family, the Libre Party, which was lost the recent election, but of course also Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, and Gustavo Petro, and the historic PACT, the left-wing political party of Colombia. And you can see that's what the U.S. is interested in, is that these remaining progressive governments in the region, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, they are a thorn in the side of the United States because they do represent an impediment to their agenda in the region. And so they're going to try to undermine support for these leaders. And they maintain to have a high degree of support. Honduras is going to have an election. I think when the time this is broadcast, the election would have already happened, the first round on Sunday, May 31st. And so, number one in the polls right now is Ivan Cepeda. The question isn't whether or not he's going to win the first round, is whether or not he's going to get enough votes to avoid a second round. Is he going to be able to get 50% plus one? And so it shows that there is still, throughout the region, an animus there for progressive leaders, left-wing ideas, even in countries where the right-wing triumphed. We can look at the example of Bolivia, where a neoliberal president Paz was elected, tried to implement his agenda, and now he's facing mass protests. The population is out in the streets resisting his agenda, and he's on the ropes. He's in a really tough situation. There's speculation that there could be basically the equivalent of martial law declared and a repressive military crackdown on the protesters to reestablish order and for him to be able to push through his agenda. I mean, essentially that's it. How do these agendas advance? Well, through repression, through coercion, through fake news, through manipulation. And it's all in service of the interests of U.S. imperialism. It's all in service of the U.S. agenda in the region. And I'll close with this, which is that we just saw this story the day we're recording on the 20th of May. Guatemala agrees to joint strikes with the U.S. against drug gangs. And so we're already seeing the strategy really taking shape in the region. I think we talked about the Shield of the Americas previously, right? This ad hoc coalition of right-wing countries in the region. And my suspicion at the time was that this isn't really about drugs. It's not really about, security. It's about the U.S. agenda, which is a militarized agenda. It's to force their policies down the throats of the population in this region because they know that they need to have that kind of force behind their agenda, because otherwise there is resistance to it. Right? Nobody wants to suffer, their wages being losing value. No one wants to see the natural resources of their country sent outside. No one wants to see foreign companies, repatriate all of the profits. But that's the agenda. That's what the United States needs. And to go back to the story around U.S. cooperation in Guatemala, there's a line here, according to the sources that spoke to the New York Times. It's really quite extraordinary. They say the following: the Trump administration is targeting Guatemala and Honduras to pressure Mexico into accepting joint counter-drug operations, those two people said. The White House's broader strategy is to normalize an American military presence across Latin America to gain leverage over Mexico, according to the two people. So you can see that it's almost unavoidable, a continental strategy. It's about trying to really corner a government like the one we have here in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has been really, really insistent that this is a red line, that we're not going to allow it. It would be seen as a violation of the country's sovereignty. It's worth remembering, for those who are unfamiliar with Mexican history, the last time, U.S. troops came into Mexico, we lost half of our territory. So it's a sore point for the Mexican population. It's not going to happen under this government. But we see this strategy. We see how they're trying to move all of the different pieces on the chessboard to make it happen. That's the priority of the United States now. It's about militarized penetration into our countries in the service of U.S. capital.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Bolivia, and of course, this was Elon Musk's famous quote: "We coup who we want to," because he wants to get, of course, at the lithium that is in Bolivia. So, yeah, of course. And I mean, and I want to get into this a little bit more too, because of course you all have covered, you and Kurt on Soberanía have covered the whole fiasco in Chihuahua with the CIA that just happened to be there, I guess, taking a drive, just hanging out. And of course, there was a new national counterterrorism strategy that was released earlier this month. Again, as you pointed out, we're recording this on Thursday, May 28th. And it lists three main types of terror groups: narco-terrorists and transnational gangs, legacy Islamist terrorists, and violent left-wing extremists, including anarchists and anti-fascists. Of course, totally absent are far-right extremist organizations. The strategy also makes it clear that it's going to use pre-crime in order to attack these supposed threats, promising to, quote, identify terror actors and plots before they happen. And of course, we see this kind of pre-crime at play, not least of all with regards to the terroristic attacks on boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And as The Intercept recently reported, under Operation Southern Spear, the U.S. military has conducted attacks on 54 so-called drug boats, killing more than 185 civilians since September. And while the administration claims that they've stopped 97% of cocaine shipments to the U.S., common sense and indeed some basic research finds that claim is the kind of stupid that even duct tape can't fix. So, Jose Luis, what are your thoughts on this new counterterrorism strategy, and what does putting it explicitly in this kind of framing, what does that do that the U.S. wasn't already doing?
So I think what it does is lay it out for us in really kind of plain and simple terms. There's no need to speculate anymore about their intentions. There was the National Security Strategy document, that kind of hinted at this. It talked about re-engagement with the Western Hemisphere. This is what it translates into. This is what it translates into in terms of what the actual strategy means. It's looking for whatever excuse they can find to continue with that strategy of a militarized penetration into the countries of Latin America. That it is very much one that is, military first. And one of the things that I think I find really quite extraordinary is actually, it's from the document itself, the counterterrorism strategy. It's on page 10. You can look it up for yourself. They talk about continuing their military and law enforcement campaigns. Got to remember, the kidnapping of Maduro was classified as a law enforcement operation against all the cartels and gangs designated as terrorist organizations as president. There, it's also worth remembering, right? This is where the strategy starts to really kind of take shape. Why is it that he declared organized crime groups that are mostly interested in making money by selling drugs and engaging in human trafficking and the like as terrorist organizations? Because it allows them to then utilize this kind of strategy in advancing their interests. And so they say following, and I'm going to be quoting directly from the document: "We will do so in concert with local governments that are willing and able to work with us. If they cannot or will not, we will still take whatever action is necessary to protect our country. And this is the key part, especially if the government in question is complicit with the cartels. So who's going to determine that? Obviously, it's going to be people like Marco Rubio, right? It's going to be the national security establishment of Washington, without any kind of due process, without any kind of an appeal. And we're already seeing that take shape in the indictment of a sitting governor of the state of Sinaloa, Ruben Rocha, here in Mexico. These are serious allegations. They should be investigated. If it turns out he does have links, obviously he, needs to be brought to justice if that is the case. Although I find it very difficult to believe the United States. I mean, these indictments you should take with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, right? These are serious. But you can see it there. You can see that, well, we asked Mexico to arrest him in order to extradite him to the United States, and they haven't yet. And so then they'll say that's proof enough for us that Mexico is complicit, so that they can act unilaterally, right? So we were just talking about this New York Times article. They're trying to pressure Mexico, trying to get all the countries in the region normalize this idea so that Claudia Sheinbaum is depicted as an outlier. And even if she continues to resist in that case, well, they'll say, well, we're just going to act unilaterally. And I think that's the worrisome part about the counterterrorism strategy. In addition to the fact that we're talking about an environment where they're also going after progressive leftists inside the United States. We've seen an outpouring of solidarity with Cuba recently, with the renewed onslaught, the hardened blockade that the U.S. is imposing on Cuba, which is causing immense suffering in Cuba, immense, a humanitarian crisis is probably the correct term. We're on the precipice of seeing, people not being able to feed themselves in Cuba as a result, not of the Cuban government's policies. I think it's important to say that, but because of the U.S. blockade. And so there are people out there who are against it, who say we shouldn't be starving. We shouldn't be conducting a medieval style siege on this country that we've actually been blockading for decades. And they're going after them. And they're using these kinds of instruments, the NSPM 7 as well, which is, this directive that came from the presidency around domestic terrorism, quote unquote, and organized political violence, to really crack down on any kind of internal dissent as well. Because the truth is that in the way that the things are shaping up in our hemisphere is that there's kind of an indispensable role, I would say, for domestic resistance to these policies. Obviously, Cuba is doing what it can in the face of this onslaught, in the face of this aggression, in the face of a potential invasion by the United States. But really, the situation, I think, can only be solved in concert with domestic resistance inside of the United States. Legal, open, I'm not talking about kind of anything underground in this sense, but, people who are opposed to this and putting pressure on their lawmakers and to try to actually have Congress, for example, pass a war powers resolution to stop a military aggression against Cuba. Cuba does not represent a national security threat to the United States. That's what they claim. That's what they're trying to, drive as a part of the effort to manufacture consent. But so it's important to think about, how all of this is kind of coming together. We see strategies like, the counterterrorism strategy for that projection of militarized U.S. power abroad, but also the crackdown on domestic opposition as well. It all kind of comes together. And again, I want to emphasize this. This is all about a strategic vision. One of the interesting things about Trump, sure, he's a more vulgar form of imperialism, but a lot of what he's doing arguably is kind of what elites in the United States have always wanted. But he's the one who's willing to spend the political capital, or at least is willing to kind of take the political hit, or is able to rally his own base despite them, at least on the surface, being opposed to forever wars, for example, to be able to use that support that he does have, that unwavering support that he has from his own political base, to do all of these things that so many people, so many of these elites in the United States have always wanted to do. For example, Marco Rubio with his dream of ousting, the Cuban Revolution from power there. So I think it's important to think about, what this is really kind of translating into now, what it actually looks like. And essentially what it translates into is, more oppression, more suffering, and possibly more violence for all of the peoples both inside and outside the United States.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the US is not at war, the US is war, and everything that it points outwards is also pointed inwards because you don't act like Rambo out in the world and then come home and act like Mr. Rogers. And I'm glad that you brought up the larger uh, the larger picture, because also in this counterterrorism strategy, it makes use of the propaganda term Red Green Alliance, which is born from an Israeli think tank, which suggests that the American left and radical Islam are in cahoots, especially, of course, when it comes to pro-Palestinian activism. And so it's really trying to link those. And of course, it's nothing new in the US. Look up the Palmer raids, COINTELPRO. The US has always been going after leftist organizing, particularly because when you come down to it, the people want the things that people on the left push for, whether that's, better working conditions or cooperative working conditions, or, less capitalism, less colonialism, less imperialism, which, as you pointed out, of course, works out for everybody, not just folks in the US. And the idea that Rocha would be a drug trafficker, well, in that case, if he were, then I feel like the Trump administration would just do what they did with Hernandez and make a friend of him. So they're also kind of telling on themselves, because if you're going to pardon an actual convicted drug trafficker, then you can't go after people you say are drug traffickers. You'd make friends of them. So it's really trying to play both sides of that. And I want to get into also what this means internally in these countries as well, because there was a recent report by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, which found that, quote, in countries where cartels' revenue sources are most diversified, the spread of militarized strategies, i.e. the US, has led to counterproductive results, such as group fragmentation and intensified competition. Cartels are increasingly waging a light footprint air war strategy, similar to the tactics employed by the US. And now in its boat strike campaign, armed groups in Mexico and Colombia are employing weaponized drones to target security forces in an effort to maximize the impact of their attacks while minimizing the costs of a direct confrontation. In Mexico, for instance, drone attacks by cartels have jumped 567% between 2023 and 2025. In Colombia, such attacks have spiked an astounding 10,600%. So, of course, Jose Luis, it's kind of a joke that any war the US wages, whatever it wages a war on, wins, like the war on drugs, the war on terror, etc. So it's not surprising that this strategy, if we should even deign to call it that, is causing a spike in violence. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is that actually the point, to create that kind of internal destabilization and to ramp up the cartel violence? And if so, what do you see in terms of a counter strategy inside places like Mexico and Colombia?
I think when you look at US actions in Mexico, let's take that as a case study, there is zero consideration for what the fallout could be. And I think about, for example, the kidnapping of El Mayo Zambada, right? A key figure in the Sinaloa cartel. We still don't even have all the details in terms of what happened. But, I think it's important to mention that, somehow he ended up inside of U.S. territory. I think the official version says that he was betrayed by elements of within his own organized crime organization. But obviously, if the plane flew into the United States knew what was going on, right? A plane is not allowed to just fly into U.S. airspace without authorization, and so now that has been one of the greatest destabilizing actions in the state of Sinaloa. It basically kicked off a war that hasn't really been able to be kind of to settle down, essentially. So you can see that whether or not it's the intent to create destabilization, arguably there are cases where that is. There's no real consideration in terms of what the impact is going to be, because ultimately the people who are paying the price are Mexicans, right? The Mexicans are the ones who are having homicides, having to deal with these. Essentially, they're like. What is it called? Toque de quedas, the where you can't go out at night, right? Because of the presence of organized crime groups. These quality of life curfews that are imposed by organized crime groups. All of this is a result of these kinds of destabilizing actions that whether advertent or not, right? Whether intentional or not, ultimately we're the ones who have to pay the price for it. And then you see, for example, and I think it's when we're talking about this, thinking about the covert actions that the United States is engaged in. So, for example, recently here in Mexico, there was a huge scandal when in a car accident, it was inadvertently revealed that there were CIA agents operating inside of Mexico. They're not allowed to operate inside of Mexico. No foreign agent is allowed to engage in operations. It violates the Constitution, but it also violates a 2020 law that was passed during López Obrador's government that explicitly prohibits them from doing it. Now, obviously, there is cooperation between the government of Mexico and the government of the United States around this, but it's limited to intelligence sharing. The idea is basically that the only forces that are allowed to operate on the ground, the only people who are allowed to have weapons in these operations are Mexican troops. So they can, if they have information, they can share it, but it's Mexican troops that lead it. And so this scandal in the state of Chihuahua revealed to us that it turns out that the CIA is not interested in respecting the Mexican law, Mexican Constitution, and we're acting unilaterally, right? Working with Maru Campos, the governor from the opposition right-wing PAN party, to do what they want, right? Essentially, and apparently, this is only one case that we learned about because of a car accident, but there's probably plenty more. There's evidence to suggest that there may have been up to 4 operations thus far where CIA agents directly participated. And maybe it would have continued had we not found out about it inadvertently because of this car accident. So all of this to say is that we can see clearly the intention of the United States to, even when they have a positive, collaborative relationship with the government, to do as they want, to do as they will, without a concern for the consequences, right? Without being worried about what potentially their actions can do in terms of destabilizing a security situation, which is very delicate. And I think it's also worth saying that the strategy in Mexico under the leadership of Claudia Sheinbaum is actually producing results. The homicide rate has dropped dramatically. So her approach has been to basically, she inherited a strategy from López Obrador, which was heavily focused on attending to the root causes of violence, to think about why is it that young people are being recruited into these organizations? How can we dissuade them? Investing in traineeship programs, opening universities, making education more accessible, giving job training programs, paying a stipend to young people so that they can get their first job. Right? These kinds of different strategies. And it was effective to a point, but obviously the homicide rate, for example, which is the one that people paid the most attention to, was stubbornly high. So she kind of took what she had and also started focusing on sort of targeted operations, targeted policing, led by her security chief, Omar Garcia Harfuch, which is also interested in looking at, where their financing comes from, looking at, what are their, how the tentacles have reached into other sectors of the economy, and also targeted operations, like kind of going after specific kind of hotspots and it's working. Hotspots of activities. So it's working. And I think in some ways that represents a threat to the United States agenda in the region, because it's an example of how you can actually solve the security question without turning to Bukele-style crackdowns, right? Where you build mega jails and basically jail, a large percentage of the population, anybody with a tattoo, even if they have nothing to do with organized crime, ends up getting jailed. And that's a model that's far more favorable to U.S. elites, U.S. policymakers. They like that model. It's the mass incarceration model is basically what the United States does at home, right? And so they support the El Salvador's efforts. They support Daniel Noboa in Ecuador's his efforts to kind of mimic the same kind of model. And they see an example like Mexico and they say, this is a threat. This is the threat of the other example. And I think that's part of why you also see this strategy that, allows illegal operations by CIA agents in a country that has made it clear that this is not allowed. And I think that's the worrisome part, is that there's basically no way to stop them in some ways. If the U.S.-Mexico relationship is actually really, really collaborative. probably to a degree that I would criticize. We're a little bit too close to the United States. We're a little bit too cozy with some of these leaders. And yet, besides that, right, you can have Marco Rubio coming to the country and heaping praise on the bilateral relationship. He literally said, I'm paraphrasing here, like, we've never had a more collaborative relationship before with a country than we do now with Mexico. And still, they go and they insist on kidnapping figures, and without concern in terms of what that's going to lead, not indicting politicians despite what the political ramifications of that, or having their CIA agents operate illegally inside of Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, the US does not understand the word collaboration ever. I mean, I don't think it's ever been part of the the dictionary since the founding of this country. And I mean, I want to, I kind of want to wrap up here. I understand that you don't, of course, have a crystal ball. But, with what we've seen, I mean, you mentioned the whole fiasco in Chihuahua, and of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We don't know what else is going on. And the way that the US is with Mexico is obviously different than it is with, like, Cuba, for instance. And I mean, they indicted 94-year-old Raul Castro a few weeks ago because apparently the genocidal blockade wasn't enough. But they've also, as we already mentioned, have sent extradition requests to Mexico, charging 10 officials in a Manhattan court with conspiracy, narcotics importation, conspiracy, and possession of machine guns and destructive devices, which, by the way, upwards of 80% of all the weapons that the narcos have in Mexico come from the US, some of them actually from US military bases, as Jose Luis has talked about on the show before. But I want to kind of get your thoughts on this, because I mean, if the US, I mean, it's not new for the US to shoot itself in the foot, but the effect on the US to actually just go ahead and invade Mexico or do something that even amps up the belligerence that we're seeing now, considering that, as you've mentioned before, because of things like NAFTA, which I'm certainly no fan of, but Mexico is the US's largest trading partner. I mean, it's like this would have such a horrific effect on the US at a time in which the economy is barely holding on anyway, partially also because of if not, well, not partially, mostly because of how ICE and the DHS are dealing with so-called or migrants and refugees. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on, do you actually think that the US would do that, understanding how detrimental that would be to the US? Or do you think at this point it's like, I don't know, we're just flailing violently, we have no idea what's going on, sure, invade Mexico?
I think if it wasn't for Claudia Sheinbaum, the U.S. would have invaded already, without a doubt. I mean, I think it's one of the regrets that Trump had from his first term. He's not an ideological man, right? But he's very ego-driven. So he wants to be seen as the one who gets things done. And we've seen it with Iran, and that's probably part of the reason why he made this boneheaded decision to attack Iran without really considering what the ramifications and the consequences were going to be. And when he's talked about it openly, about how he'll be the quote-unquote person with the honor to have taken Cuba, he's like, oh, I've been hearing about this since I was a little boy. So it's an ego-driven thing. So I think when it comes to the issue of organized crime, with the very real effects that drugs have on so many communities in the United States, he wants to be seen as the one to say, I fixed it, right? And I think he thinks he can fix it by bombing drug labs. And he thinks he can fix it by having U.S. boots on the ground and, engaging in these kind of fantasies of, special forces coming in and taking out key leaders of these organized crime groups, as if that would actually solve anything, because it arguably wouldn't. Not until you do something about the demand will there ever really be a solution. Somebody else is going to pop up, maybe somebody more violent, or these fractured groups will fight each other, and only the kind of the worst of the worst will rise to the top, and that'll be the new person that is leading these organizations and committing even worse crimes. So if it wasn't for Claudia Sheinbaum, if it wasn't for her steadfast resistance to this agenda, I think it would have happened already. And so the article that I quoted at the beginning kind of tells us just how important it is to them. They're literally pressuring other governments that are in a more difficult position, that have less to bargain with, in order to create this consensus in the region and try to marginalize Mexico as being the only one that's resisting this. They created the Shield of the Americas, bringing together all these right-wing countries to also promote the same exact strategy. They prop up Daniel Noboa, who has credible allegations of being tied to narco trafficking as well. They pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez because he's going to do something that's going to serve them down the road, creating this website, coming into power in Honduras. You can see all of these different elements. And so, I think the danger is real. I think that there is cause for concern, especially when you read things like the counterterrorism strategy, where they say that, well, if they're complicit, we're going to operate anyway. In terms of the consequences of that, it would be devastating. It would radically change the U.S.-Mexico relationship overnight. I think that Claudia has been talking about this issue in a sense of like prepping the country, of understanding that she's resisting, she's trying to negotiate this, but also if it does come to pass, that the population has to be ready for what that's going to mean. And yeah, you're right. You talk about, for example, the USMCA negotiations, which are set to actually really kind of start in earnest now, as a means of trying to extract more concessions from that. But if they make this decision, if they do act unilaterally in Mexico, this is me speculating, but I would imagine it would be the end of that agreement. It would be, even though that would represent a huge hit for the Mexican population, it's such an important point. The defense of sovereignty is so important for Mexicans that they would be willing to endure hardship over the short term to defend it in the face of a direct aggression. I also think there's something to be said about what it would mean in terms of how countries will relate to the United States. Let's go back to Cuba, for example. Cuba, I've said this in many occasions, it occupies a really special place in the hearts of the Latin American population. It is the country that stood up to U.S. imperialism, that was able to oust a U.S.-backed dictator. It was a country that resisted an invasion. It is a country that has endured despite a decades-long blockade. I think a direct aggression against Cuba, maybe I'm being hopeful here and maybe I'm being a little bit naive, but I would hope that it would actually produce a very serious backlash in the region. We haven't seen it yet. We saw the kidnapping of Maduro. We've seen this campaign of extrajudicial executions. And sure, there have been statements and comments, right? But no real kind of forceful response. I would think that an attack on Cuba would produce that. It would certainly produce it amongst the social movements. It would produce it amongst the trade unions, right? People who have a direct relationship with Cuba. I, as someone who is very familiar with the way that U.S. imperialism operates, if I do see it would elevate my own kind of commitment to resistance to U.S. imperialism if you see something like that. And arguably the same would be true of Mexico, right? That it would be seen as kind of a watershed moment for U.S. Latin America relations. So they're playing with fire. It's a dangerous situation for the United States, for their policymakers. And they just shown, to go back to the question of Iran, that their advisors are sometimes wrong, that they don't make a calculation to say, hey, this could actually have some blowback. I just recently saw that markets essentially are not predicting $3 a gallon until 2032. How do they expect the U.S. population to endure these sky-high energy prices for that long? All of these things that I think aren't calculated. And so I would assume that in the case of Cuba, in the case of Mexico, there probably isn't a good enough appreciation in terms of the fallout from a decision like this. And I think it's important for us here on programs like this to really talk about that precisely. That in the case of Cuba, for example, if they invade, it's going to be a disaster. And it's not going to be a disaster that's going to be over in a matter of days. It'll take years to, if at all possible, to reestablish kind of a stable government in Cuba. You would be facing an insurrectionary campaign from all of the cadre that obviously have been preparing for something like this. It would not be a governable situation. You would have a refugee crisis, right on your shores. Same with Mexico. It would produce just such a destabilizing force that there has to be a greater appreciation, in Langley, in Washington, in terms of what all of this can actually be, because they've shown that their lack of appreciation for predicting what could happen can come at an extraordinarily high price. And I think they are this ego-driven man, and all the yes men that surround him really need to kind of keep him in check, because things can get really bad. And here in Latin America, we've been here before. we kind of, in a sense, I don't want to be flippant, but are prepared to suffer, are prepared to deal with um, the fallout of this of a regional conflict. I don't think the U.S. population is going to be very patient with these kinds of decisions in the United States.
No, and I mean to a greater degree. I mean, there's been so much propaganda, particularly about Iran, so people in the U.S. don't feel as much camaraderie. And of course, there's been dehumanizing propaganda about Mexico, but so many people in the U.S. have been to Mexico because it's right there. Not many people have been to Iran. So, in order to create that kind of animosity, you have to try a lot harder. And on the show before, we've had Shir Haver talking about how we shouldn't think about the goals of this war machine as at all concerned with the well-being of people in the US, because of course it's not. But at the same time, there is that arrogance and ignorance, like not understanding that people, when you attack them, will actually fight back harder, and they will build solidarity harder than they were even before, which of course we see happening in Iran. We saw that happen in Iraq, and we could go down the list. But I think that's a very important thing to note, and also, of course, why it's so important for folks in the U.S. to build solidarity, especially with Mexico, because again, it's right there. And y'all can
Not to
check out.
mention the 40 plus million Mexican people that live in the United States. I think there has to be more consideration made for this. But I like the term you use. Is let's combine it, this arrogant ignorance. It's
It's
going to lead the United States into disaster.
yeah,
And
I
the
mean,
people, the working classes of the United States are the ones who are going to pay the price for it, unfortunately.
of course, always. I mean, whether it's tariffs or war, it's always the people who end up paying for it. So So yeah, folks, you can check out the earlier interviews with Jose Luis, where we talked more about things like the Shield of the Americas and the so-called war on drugs, and also, of course, please do check out Soberanía. It's a great podcast that really, it's in English, and it's a great podcast that really breaks down a lot of what's happening, not just in Mexico but in the entire region. So, Jose Luis, thank you again so much for taking the time to sit down with us.
No, of course. Thanks so much for inviting me.